coronavirus is taking lives and bleeding economies, and the leaders of the world have a double challenge now: to save lives and to save livelihoods. And with me today on Straight Talk is a leader who perhaps has the most difficult job in the world right now, the finance minister of the world's largest democracy, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman. Welcome to WION.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. As I said, the world is facing a difficult challenge. It is the worst pandemic in 100 years. The worst economic recession is what we are staring at in about 100 years. As the finance minister of the world's fifth largest economy, how do you assess your task?
At the very least, challenging. But it's a very complex challenge. And as it is in India, every issue or every policy decision has its own complexity when in comparison to any other country. Because India, because of its diversity, because of the uneven spread of wealth, also because of the levels of literacy, every policy becomes all the more complex when you try to implement it. Here, it's the Prime Minister's initiative, leadership literally from the front, and taking this whole issue of the pandemic, clearly understanding it has two clear dimensions. One, the human side of it, where you want to save every life. Save every life is not easy, especially, as I said, in a complex, large country like India. And the other is what's going to happen to the livelihoods, what's going to happen to the business. The wheels of the economy will have to, get restarted. So he did very clearly say this is a big, as I say in Hindi and in Sanskrit, dharma shankat. It's a difficult situation where your emphasis first had to be on lives. You did your maximum to contain the pandemic. Now it's nearing the time when we have to restart. So it's a big challenge, complex challenge, and a challenge which has got to be taken up front. That's what the Prime Minister is doing for us.
Indeed, and like every dark cloud, this too has a silver lining. So of all the projections that we've seen so far, only two countries, India and China, have some growth projections, not a zero GDP or a negative. What role do you think India can play in stabilizing the global economy?
This was something which was said, and I've heard it very often before the pandemic set in, well before the pandemic set in, sometime middle of last year, that if there are engines of growth for the global economies, all across, emerging, developed, not so developed, it's only two countries, and they are India and China. Even after the pandemic, you were right in pointing out, if there are only two countries which are going to be the engine again, it's China and India again. And what gives me the confidence to say that this holds good even now are macroeconomic fundamentals. They are strong, they have been strong, and it is on the fact that our fundamentals are strong, we are able to face a lockdown which is fairly severe. And it had to be the kind of lockdown that we announced with the extensions given over the time, because, as I said, the health infrastructure had to take it all and respond in time. So with all that, it is because of the macroeconomic fundamentals being what they are, that even today we have a hope that Indian entrepreneurs, given the right kind of support, will be able to come out and start the economy all over again. And Indian entrepreneurial skills have not just survived during happy days. Periodically you've seen them coming out of difficult times, whether it's times of failed monsoon, failed drought, or repeated cyclones, or even when the license quota Raj existed. So I'm strongly of the view that our businesses and the entrepreneurial spirit of Indians will come out of this difficulty only if the government also can stand by them. And on that, the Prime Minister is very clear. We shall stand with industry. as we go, we keep changing, tweaking, coming up with newer thoughts to help them. So I'm confident, yes, we'll be the engine of growth.
Sure. In your budget speech in February, ma'am, you'd spoken of a 10% nominal growth for India. As things stand today, we'll be happy with any growth. What does this mean for a $5 trillion economy plan?
Let me put it this way. The budget estimates of 1st February 2020 will now have to be re-looked. None of my assumptions will hold good. But that's not to say, so what are you going to be doing about it? I don't think any one of us understood to what extent, and even now I think we are not very clear, to what extent this pandemic's impact will be on the economy. Of course, all of us are watching it. Like for instance, today the Q4's figures are going to be out. It is something which we'll have to see as we go. But we are very clear that the assumptions, at least some of the assumptions, will not restrict me from reaching out to the industry which need the help. So it's not as if I'm going to be stuck on my assumptions of 1st February 2020 and say, so sorry, I can't extend beyond this. No. Now every option is kept open because ultimately we want the economy to be up and going. So yes, things have changed from the last budget. We'll have to see how it goes.
The GDP figures for the last quarter of the last financial year, the first 3 months of this year, have just come. 3.1% growth is what we've seen, and this was before the impact of the lockdown. We are also looking at the core industries data, a 38% decline in growth for the month of April. How do you see these figures?
Well, 3.1 for the last quarter. A quarter where we thought we started seeing green shoots, because the way in which through the banks credit was pushed between September, October, November. And that is one of the reasons why the budgetary estimates were made the way it was made. But if the contraction that you're talking about in core sector is about 35%, that is in April, which is into this financial year, by which time the coronavirus has hit us really fully and badly. So the 3.1, actually, given the fact that by February we started having some kind of an impact of the pandemic, therefore gives me the feeling that revival was happening, but unfortunately the God's hand started playing.
And going forward, most agencies projecting a contraction of 5%. What's your estimate?
I said I shall not do an estimate. I shall wait to see how it pans out. I am watching and hearing agencies tell us about what extent to which this contraction is going to hit India. As I said, it's my duty to be prepared to face the situation and be ready to help, be ready to support, rather than spend time now on what will be the expected contraction. I'm ready. I'm with the full support of the Prime Minister. We want to ensure that everybody gets the required support.
In the past 2 months, India has seen the rise of a 10,000 crore PPE industry. According to one report, in 60 days, we've seen a 56-fold increase in PPE manufacturing, making India the second largest manufacturer in the world. We are sending medicines to the world. We are the vaccine capital of the world. What is the growth potential of this industry, and what are the untapped avenues that you are now exploring?
The untapped avenues are medical devices, vaccine first. You mentioned that. At least 8 big vaccine producers of the country, the research labs, are all now absolutely speedily engaged in this race. And I'm very confident that India will be setting the pace on this one. And therefore, that itself is one of the big untapped areas. Yes, we are already producing, but now you see the potential of having to keep abreast of the developments, and Indian industry will do that. Besides that, of course, something which you would have heard, I would have heard, and it's been something which has been on the cards, but actually India shall be the food basket of the world. The agri-export is something on which I think, without value addition, India can be the supplier for the globe and the production in agriculture. Even the smallest of farmer with a very divided holding, with him having hardly any size holding which is respectable, the production has not suffered at all. Periodically, of course, he faces all kinds of upsets. Prices crash, his crop is taken away, like the way locusts have come into India. But Indian farming strength needs all the support, and that is why I'm happy to say that one of the things that we announced in this package was to give infrastructure for agriculture. So I think agriculture is one of the things in which we expect a big contribution, global contribution from India in order to have agri exports promoted. Other than that, of course, many of the industries which are relocating from different parts of the world, we are giving them a good hearing on what they expect for them to relocate. And in that, not just that one big mother industry, but also the ecosystem which it requires, together with it, the component manufacturers and others. So we are moving very fast on it. Already, I think we did some for the electronics sector. So we are on that pace in getting very many relocatable industries to come to India now and set up business here.
I've also asked that. In fact, you said supplying agricultural supplies. The world is realizing that when you depend on one country and one region only for the supplies, then it can be not a very good proposition. And they're looking at economic distancing from China. There are talks of the government being engaged with 1,000 odd companies. Do you see this as an opportunity for India, and how are you creating that ecosystem for companies to leave countries like China and move to India?
It is certainly an opportunity, but yet I would rather look at it as India becoming a manufacturing hub, India becoming a best place for investment on very many other strengths. It cannot be a reactive thing alone. You know, somebody shifting from somewhere, I want them here, therefore. That can be one approach, but I think it should be a larger approach of anyone shifting from anywhere should find India attractive. And your attractiveness is not dependent purely on the taxation incentives that you can offer. Yes, it matters. When the taxation is very high, nobody would want to come here, even if you have the best of skills. But even with that said, that taxation side of things taken care of, I think the compliance burden, the unpredictability of policy, fear of retrospective taxation, fear of of taxmen, these are all factors which either vitiate or help in that kind of an environment which can draw investments. And I would want to play a lot on them to make sure that it need not always be a targeted, incentive based approach to drawing industry and drawing investment. It should be a blanket, yes, investment in India is the best thing because they have the best environment, it's easy to do business there, above all they have the best of talents. If that's something which we can build for India, that's the Atmanirbhar Bharat which I think PM is talking about.
Right, and I'm assuming that's work in progress. WION is a channel that is watched, as I told you, in more than 100 countries, and a lot of business heads and CEOs would be watching this interview. What is the message, ma'am, that you want to give out to them and tell them why they should come and invest in India and work in India?
I think the best thing about India is, for all that we talk, it is a law-abiding country. Rule of law is something which is held high. There may be delays. I'm not looking the other way in facing these realities. Delays in courts, delays in law enforcing agencies doing things, and so on. There may be any such, but ultimately it is a country which believes in rule of law. There are no distortions to what has been laid in the law. And now that Prime Minister Modi has made a lot of emphasis on corruption-free, policy-driven, zero cronyism kind of an approach, policy is what we are working on, better policy, better friendly policy. So that will be one of the best things for India. Whether people recognize it or not, in the large sweep of demographic dividend, we seem to ignore the fact that our youth have always had the right skill sets. That is why most often earlier Indians went abroad to some of the best positions. Today, if we create that environment in India, our youth can find similar and very interesting and challenging opportunities in India itself, and that should be also a big draw for investors. So I think
that's a big if.
I don't think it's an if. We've improved a lot in terms of keeping youth retained in India with good challenging positions. Of course, we have a lot more to do, and if opportunities are more on the grounds of job satisfaction, of course your payback also, because you're growing, it's the best of your years and so on. Opportunities in India today are some of the best, and I think therefore youth see a lot of potential. What is not here, they can come and do, if only many other things are made easy for them.
Right. As we attract investors from outside, there's also a lot of talk of hostile takeovers. Do you see a threat of hostile takeovers of distressed assets in India by foreign firms?
That's certainly a worry, in that with the valuations being cut so badly, and with the lockdown and the entire world being upset because of the way in which demands have drastically fallen, movement of people being affected. So what is favorable actually at this time? Not really very many factors which will help in the valuation to be kept high. So there is definitely this risk of companies getting into a distress mode, and market being market, that will be the best time for people who want to come and buy. But people with deep pockets, that's a reality. But of course, we have to take care that businesses which have been built by the sweat and toil of Indians, and which have had a great brand value, cannot be allowed to be picked up by people who are just looking for an opportunity. So that is a factor which all of us are worried about, and that's a factor on which we'll certainly do something to ensure that Indian industries don't get picked up at a throwaway price, because we want them to be able to run their business once everything is normal back again.
Are there particular areas of concern?
No, I would look at every area in which Indian businesses are going to be vulnerable. We do not want them to suffer.
And we know that FDI norms were changed recently to prevent something like this. What other steps, if any, are being looked at?
Well, we are also making sure that the regulators will be able to look at various existing options through which they can ensure that distressed companies are not going to be picked up easily. So regulators will also keep a watch. In fact, they have been fairly active in getting to know about even the secondary market operations through which companies are getting picked up, or their shareholdings are getting drastically changed, and so on. So I would think it will be a combination of the government and the regulators to keep an eye on the developments.
In the last 19 years, FDI from Hong Kong into India has been 23,000 crores. But now the situation is changing. China has introduced a new law, and investors are jittery. How do you view this in terms of the impact on business and investments from Hong Kong?
See, I think as it is in the company's law, and also in the way in which markets are being regulated, this actual holding is something which is not very, very transparent. You have to watch out to see who's actually behind any kind of investment which is happening. And particularly areas like Hong Kong, Vietnam, when investments come through those routes, you tend to think, is it really coming there? But we had this kind of a difficulty and suspicion even when it was routed through other countries which were treated as tax havens. So irrespective of the destination, I think it is the investment itself which will have to be looked, without of course hurting any investment which might come in all fairness. But it is important for the regulators to have a keen eye to see that there is a fair and transparent mechanism through which you actually understand the actual ownership and also the actual money, the source of money from where it is coming. So I would play a lot on the regulators to understand not just the geographical location, but also the background of the investments which come in, because that's now attained a certain level of criticality.
We've gone through 4 rounds of lockdown. Where do we stand today according to you, and have we been able to achieve what we set out to, and at what cost?
As I said, it was first lives of people. We wanted to be sure. At a time when we had about just 100 cases, the approach and the clarity with which one had to deal with this kind of a pandemic was unclear to many. The only approach which everyone thought was the way to protect human lives was the lockdown. Keep everyone away, at home, stay safe, do not have too much of a congregation or crowd, and so on. So lockdown was taken up as one of the best ways in which you can ensure lives are safer. So we did that. Gradually, when you were clear that you were able to contain it in some places, 1 or 2 instances changed the course. And then you had to be sure that even despite such things, we need to be protective of lives. That is why I think India went through without a break 1, 2, 3 lockdowns and so on. Whereas there are some countries which have lifted the lockdown and then gone back to it all over again. We didn't risk that. At what cost is a very big question, very relevant question. Yes, it has meant that the economy had to take a big beating. How much is it? We'll have to wait and see. But whatever it is, the government is very clear that we'll stand by our industry, stand by our entrepreneurs, stand by our farmers. We need our economy to be supported, and we should support them.
For your job in this situation, I don't think there's a template. I think you're the only finance minister of this country who is dealing with such a monumental economic impact of a health crisis. And India's challenge is unique. You said that there are many Indias. It's a country of a lot of diversity. Other countries aren't dealing with our challenges. Other countries aren't dealing with this level of exodus along with a pandemic. As the finance minister, how do you set out your priorities, and what is the brief that was given to you by the Prime Minister?
While the brief may be one thing, but he went through it as though he was the finance minister himself with great detail. I was doing it at one side and he was doing it at the. Both of us consulted and also heard so many people. I consulted from my own side, he was consulting with people, experts. It was all publicly available. Everybody could see it. The chief ministers, economists, business leaders, associations. Intensely, he kept himself informed, and he would exchange all that he's heard with us. And then we would go back to him with a lot of, let us say, proposals. So the intensity was equally shared, if not much more shared, by the Prime Minister himself. And with that kind of a support, I suppose it's only easy for me to say, right, with the support of the Prime Minister, all of us are working together and we are able to come up with something. But the intensity, the scale and the expanse of the consultation brought in a great deal of clarity. And that clarity is what has made a difference in us being clearly responsible in the way in which we have addressed the economic distress. And it's also the way in which we are able to say, look, we are open, we shall continue to remain open and ready to hear people. So I cannot but in sufficient words say that it is possible to take on this kind of a challenging assignment only because the team around you and the leadership with you has given equal support. So,
right, we are easing restrictions, and at the same time the number of cases continues to rise. Recently in Tamil Nadu, a factory had to be shut because 40 people tested positive. So we are shutting, starting, restarting, shutting again, and I think this cycle, do you think, will go on for the foreseeable future? And how big a challenge then becomes unlocking the lockdown?
Yeah, it is a challenge. It is a challenge. As I said, Can you continue with a lockdown of this nature, given the fact that the economy and the people have abided by the call of the Prime Minister and put lives before everything else? And even with all that, you've had a lot of difficulty in being able to attend to every need of every citizen. That itself has been a bit of a challenge. But now when you want to open up, you want to be sure that you're not putting people's lives to danger, but that is a risk. Because we have to be sure with a pandemic like this, where no one really knows what and when it subsides means. It has subsided. Does anyone know what it means really? So I suppose we have to go along and take a risk. And that is why in stages, in every lockdown announcement, you find some relaxations being offered, because how long can you, after all, hold back people from doing their normal functions?
Right. And job losses remain a serious concern. Job losses have been announced across sectors and industries. And what is your estimate, first of all, as to how bad this could get in the days and months ahead? And what can the government practically do for the salaried class to cushion the impact of this? Because this is the class that makes up the bulk of your taxes.
But the point here is, at this stage, to assess the impact on employment will be difficult, because you can see a lot of distortions happening. People being sent back home, kept on rolls but not getting paid, being asked to take voluntary without pay, kind of staying away from work. So on employment, it's going to have to wait for some time for us to understand what is the calibrated way in which each employer has handled his own. But also, I'm already getting information about how many of them have probably started working 20%, 30% capacity, and they're getting their workers back. Like in Haryana, the government had put up a portal of those who wanted to come back. And there were just 2 days in which they just couldn't handle that many requests had come. That's not to say everybody is coming back, but that's also to say there are signs of people wanting to come back. We'll have to see how it goes in the next few days. After all, we are at the very fag end of this lockdown. We'll have to see if the government is going to lift it all up or still retain it with some conditions.
Ma'am, this pandemic has been equated to a war. People are calling it the Third World War or something of that scale. In a war, military spending goes up. So in a pandemic or a health war, would health spending go up? Is that what you see in your future budget?
Yes, I announced it during my 5-day announcement of the package. I very clearly said, we shall now have more monies given for the health infrastructure. And not only just the government putting money in public health infrastructure, but we are also giving a viability gap funding, meaning if anyone wants to set up a hospital or something in a tier 3 city, they can obviously take bank loan, but we shall give them the viability gap funding, which is if you are expected to pay a certain margin money, government will come in to pay at least somewhat or that margin which is expected of an entrepreneur to give in when the bank provides you the funding. So by giving that kind of an opportunity to private players, we want to scale up this attempt to widen and strengthen the medical infrastructure in this country, and also colleges and the capacities for having more doctors trained, nurses trained are all being expanded. You know, the way in which Medical Council of India was recently, only probably middle of last year, revamped completely so that we have a better regulation of medical practice in this country.
Right, and also per capita government spending on healthcare has doubled in 5 years. You spoke about the economic package, but direct government spending is limited, and also there are questions on where this money is coming from, ma'am.
Obviously, at this stage, I've said that two things. One, what we are spending at the moment, we'll have to see where the money goes. So at this stage, I would put a lot of emphasis to see that it goes to the right causes, which will trigger the economy to, start up. The other, over and above the budgetary estimates on the borrowing, I had announced a rescheduled, reworked borrowing calendar, which obviously says how much is going to be borrowed by the government, at what time and a period, what is the schedule. That's also been announced. So it will be a combination of revenue generated either from taxation or from disinvestment and non-tax revenues, and also to look at borrowings. It obviously has to be a combination of all this.
Another big announcement was for MSMEs, 3 lakh crores, which will benefit 45 lakh units. But we have 6 crore MSMEs in India. What happens to the rest of the 5.5 crore?
At no point in time is every enterprise looking for immediate help. You go on an average. And for the first round, we have announced this. As we go along, we'll have to see how many more would want to have any kind of help. So it's not to limit it at 45 lakhs, but also to say, start with this number, let this lot get the first tranche of it, and then we'll see as we go on.
How is this pandemic, though, affecting you personally, your family? Because we see you holding press conferences and firefighting pretty much round the clock. But I'm sure this also has a personal dimension, ma'am.
I've been very lucky. My family is here. They've been absolutely supportive. Of course, I have elders in my house. That was a bit worrying because I keep coming out to the ministry, also going and ensuring. Most of it's virtual, but you do interact with people. So I had to take a lot more precautions and make sure that nothing, upsets them in the sense of physical contact or whatever. So that was the initial worry. But later on, I think all of us have got adjusted to the social distancing and so on. Very difficult times. So it's not just for me, but I think the entire country has braved it. And that, when I see people facing it and being brave enough to, hold their heads high and say, let's see how we'll go away, this has also got to pass, gives me a lot of strength and motivation.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and all the best to you.
Thank you.